The woman in the photograph says you stole her daughter's face. Those were the first words Sophie Whitmore spoke after Megan found her standing barefoot at the frost-covered edge of the lake at 3:17 in the morning. But the story had begun 6 hours earlier, with a camera no one remembered packing and a photograph that should never have existed. Megan had not wanted to return to Bellwether, Maine, when the roads narrowed beneath black pine branches and the lake looked like dark glass pressed against the earth. Her grandfather Thomas had been dead for 3 weeks, and the old Crawford house had been left to her mother, Helen, who refused to set foot inside it. So Megan came with her husband, Luke, and their 10-year-old daughter, Sophie, planning to spend one weekend sorting furniture, boxing papers, and deciding what could be sold. The house stood 2 miles outside town, a cedar-sided home with a stone chimney and a porch sloping toward the water. It had been built in 1911. Megan remembered visiting as a child, but only in fragments. A red hallway runner, the smell of dust and lake water, her grandfather's hands adjusting an old camera. Beyond that, her memories ended in a blank wall. By the time they arrived, daylight was fading. Luke carried boxes from the sport utility vehicle while Sophie wandered through the rooms, announcing every discovery as if the house were a museum. Megan opened curtains, checked the thermostat, and tried not to notice how the framed family photographs seemed to follow her. Most were black and white portraits of people she recognized. Thomas as a young man, Helen in a school dress, couples standing beside the lake, children seated on porch steps with solemn expressions. In nearly every picture, someone had been lost beneath glare, shadow, or damage to the paper. Just after 8, Sophie found the instant camera inside the bottom drawer of a walnut cabinet, wrapped in a yellow dish towel. It was large, square, and heavier than modern models. Thomas's initials had been scratched into the leather strap. "Does it still work?" Sophie asked. Megan turned it over. The battery compartment looked clean, and a cartridge of film was already inside. "It should not. This film has to be decades old." Sophie grinned. "That means it is haunted." Luke, kneeling by the fireplace, laughed and told her not to give the house ideas. The joke settled strangely in the room. A gust moved against the windows, though the trees outside were still. Megan almost put the camera back, but Sophie begged for one family picture. They stood before the fireplace, Luke on the left, Megan in the middle, Sophie against her right side. Sophie set the camera on a shelf and used the timer. A mechanical whir filled the room, followed by a bright flash. The photograph slid out with a click. At first it looked blank. Slowly, shapes rose beneath the glossy surface. The fireplace appeared first, then Luke's flannel shirt, Sophie's striped sweater, Megan's face. And then the woman emerged between them. She was narrow, dressed in a black gown from another century. One hand rested beside Megan's shoulder, though Megan had felt nothing. Her head angled towards Sophie. Where her face should have been, there was smooth gray skin, featureless and flat, as if the image had forgotten how to finish her. Sophie stopped smiling. Luke leaned closer. "That is a processing defect," he said, but his voice had lost its humor. Megan looked over her shoulder. The space between her and Sophie was empty. She looked back. The woman remained. Then Megan noticed the clock. In the picture, above the mantel, Thomas's wall clock showed 3:17. In the room itself, its hands were frozen at 11:42, where they had stopped years ago. Luke examined the camera, searching for a trick. Sophie asked who the woman was. Megan said she did not know, but the answer came too quickly, and something cold moved through her chest. The dress felt familiar, not from a photograph, but from a dream she could almost remember. A figure at the end of a hallway, black fabric brushing the floor. A hand raised toward a child whose name had been erased. Megan placed the photograph face down and told everyone it was time for bed. Upstairs, the wind moved around the house in low breaths. Pipes clicked inside the walls. Floorboards creaked in rooms. Megan lay awake beside Luke, staring at the ceiling while the faceless woman replayed in her mind. At 3:17, she opened her eyes to the sound of the back door closing. Sophie's bed was empty. Megan ran downstairs and found the door open to the cold. Bare footprints crossed the frost, and continued toward the lake. Sophie stood at the shoreline in her nightgown, her toes inches from the black water. She was facing someone Megan could not see. Megan rushed forward, wrapped a coat around her, and pulled her back. Sophie did not resist. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness. Luke met them at the porch, wrapped Sophie in blankets, and warmed her feet with towels near the fire. Megan knelt in front of her. "Who were you talking to?" she whispered. Sophie turned. "The woman from the picture." Megan held her tighter. "What did she want?" Sophie looked toward the house, where the window reflected a tall black shape behind the glass. Then she repeated the words that would change everything Megan believed about her family, her childhood, and her own name. "She says you stole her daughter's face." By sunrise, Luke no longer remembered seeing the woman in the photograph. Megan realized it when he came downstairs carrying 2 mugs of coffee and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the instant picture between her hands. He glanced at it once, frowned, and asked why she looked so pale. Megan turned the photograph toward him. The faceless woman still stood between her and Sophie, her dark dress blending into the shadow beside the fireplace. "You saw her last night," Megan said. Luke studied the image for several seconds. "Saw who?" Megan pointed to the figure. Luke leaned closer, then looked at Megan with concern. "There is nobody there. It is just the 3 of us." The words struck harder than they should have. Megan looked down again. The woman had not disappeared. Her smooth, unfinished face remained angled towards Sophie, and one narrow hand hovered beside the child's shoulder. Megan asked Sophie what she saw. Sophie stood near the counter, wrapped in a blanket, her hair still damp from the frost that had collected during the night. She did not move closer. "She is still there," she whispered. Luke set down the coffee and told them both that the old film had developed unevenly, creating stains and shadows that their minds were turning into a person. His explanation sounded reasonable, which made Megan trust it even less. She asked him about the clock in the picture. He looked again and said the hand showed 11:42, the same time as the clock above the mantel. Megan stared at him. In her hands, the photograph clock still read 3:17. She carried the picture into the living room and held it beneath the morning light. Nothing changed. Luke followed, speaking carefully now, as if trying not to frighten her. Sophie stayed near the doorway. Megan looked from the photograph to the wall clock and felt something inside her memory shift, like a door trying to close. She repeated the woman's message aloud. "You stole her daughter's face." Luke said Sophie had been sleepwalking and must have invented the sentence after seeing the damaged picture. Sophie shook her head. "She said it before I saw her face." The room went silent. Megan asked what that meant. Sophie pulled the blanket tighter around herself. She said that when she found the instant camera, a woman had whispered from inside the cabinet. The voice told her to take a family picture because Megan had forgotten someone. Sophie had thought the voice belonged to her mother in another room. She had not mentioned it because everyone was busy. Luke crouched beside her and asked whether she had heard the voice again. Sophie nodded toward the photographs hanging along the hallway. "She's in those too." Megan turned. There were 12 framed pictures on the wall, arranged from the oldest near the stairs to the newest beside the kitchen. She had examined them the evening before and noticed only water damage, shadows, and faded corners. Now, in the earliest portrait, a dark figure stood behind a seated family. In the next, the same woman appeared near a porch column. In another, she was reflected in a window behind a group of children. Her clothing changed with the decades. A high collar became a plain black dress, then a long coat, then a dark blouse. Her face never changed. It remained blank. Luke saw none of it. Megan began taking the frames down one by one. Some contained names and dates written on the back. Crawford Family Picnic, 1934. Helen's 8th birthday, 1966. Thomas and Evelyn at the Lake, 1972. In every generation, the faceless woman moved closer to one child. In the first photograph, she stood several feet away. In the next, she was at the child's side. In the final picture of each sequence, her hand rested on the child's shoulder, as though marking or shielding them. Then the child disappeared from every photograph that followed. Megan spread the frames across the rug and arranged them by date. The pattern was too precise to dismiss. A boy named Samuel appeared in 3 photographs from the 1930s, then vanished after the woman touched him. A girl named Lydia stood beside the lake in 1951, then disappeared from every later portrait. No obituary, no memorial picture, no note explained what had happened to either child. It was as if the family had continued without noticing the empty space. Sophie knelt beside Megan and pointed to a photograph taken in the summer of 1998. 2 girls stood beneath the cedar tree near the water. One was clearly Megan at 10 years old, wearing denim shorts and a yellow shirt. The other girl, dressed in a blue shirt, looked almost identical. Same height, same dark hair, same serious eyes. They could have been twins. The faceless woman stood far behind them, barely visible between the branches. Megan picked up the frame and felt a pressure behind her eyes. She remembered the yellow shirt. She remembered the smell of sunscreen and wet pine needles. She remembered running toward the house because someone was calling from an upstairs window, but she did not remember the girl beside her. On the back, in Thomas Crawford's narrow handwriting, were 5 words. Megan and Nora, summer of 1998. Megan read the name twice. Nora. It carried a strange weight, not like a new word, but like one she had been forbidden to say. She asked Luke whether her mother had ever mentioned Nora. He shook his head. Sophie touched the glass over the second girl. She looks like you. Megan called Helen immediately. Her mother answered after the 4th ring, sounding tired and guarded. Megan asked who Nora was. Silence filled the line. It lasted so long that Megan checked whether the call had ended. Then Helen said Thomas had mislabeled many photographs during the last years of his life. There had never been a Nora in the family. Megan described the 2 girls. Helen interrupted before she finished and told her to put the photograph back where she found it. Her voice sharpened when Megan mentioned the woman without a face. Do not look through the old albums, Helen said. Do not let Sophie use that camera again. Leave the house before dark. Megan asked why. Helen whispered something too softly to understand, then ended the call. Luke tried to persuade Megan that grief was affecting both her and Helen, but Megan barely heard him. She returned to the cabinet where Sophie had found the camera and pulled open every drawer. Beneath a stack of table linens, she discovered a leather album tied with a cracked ribbon. The cover smelled faintly of smoke. Inside were photographs spanning more than 80 years, and the woman appeared in every one. Near the middle, Megan found another picture from 1998. She and Nora stood on the dock, holding hands. This time the woman was directly behind Nora, one pale hand resting on the girl's shoulder. Megan turned the page. The next photograph showed Megan alone. When she looked back, the picture on the dock had changed. Nora was still there, but her face had begun to fade. Megan watched Nora's face disappear one feature at a time. First, the eyes softened into gray smudges beneath the glass. Then the nose and mouth faded until the second girl beside her became a blank shape wearing the blue shirt from the earlier photograph. Megan pressed her thumb against the photograph as though she could hold the image in place, but the paper had already settled into its new version. Sophie stood beside her, breathing quickly. She is doing it again, she said. Luke looked over Megan's shoulder and saw only one child on the dock. He insisted that there had never been 2 girls in the picture, and when Megan showed him the words written on the back, he read them as Megan at the lake, summer of 1998. Nora's name had vanished from the ink. Megan felt the room tilt around her. The house had not changed, but the evidence had. She carried the album into the kitchen and photographed every page with her phone, hoping a digital copy might preserve what the paper refused to keep. On her screen, each image appeared normal for several seconds, then adjusted itself. Nora vanished from one picture after another. Her outline remained as a pale distortion near Megan, a space where the background looked stretched. By noon, snow had begun to fall over Bellwether, thin white lines crossing the lake and covering the road beneath the pines. Megan called Helen again, but her mother did not answer. 40 minutes later, headlights moved through the trees. Helen's sedan stopped hard beside the porch, and she came inside without knocking. She wore a wool coat over a sweatshirt and flannel pants, and her snow boots were only half-laced. She had driven nearly 60 miles without a suitcase. Her eyes went first to Sophie, then to the instant camera on the table. "Where did you find that?" she asked. Sophie pointed toward the walnut cabinet. Helen crossed the room and grabbed the camera by its leather strap. Her hands trembled so badly that the body struck the table twice. Megan placed the album in front of her and opened it to the doc photograph. "Who is Nora?" Helen did not look down. "There was no Nora. You said that on the phone." "Because it is true." Megan turned the picture over and showed her the faint marks where the name had been. Helen's expression changed. For 1 second, recognition passed across her face, followed by a fear so old it seemed practiced. She closed the album and pushed it away. "Your grandfather made mistakes. He wrote names that did not belong to anyone. Was Nora my sister?" Helen stared toward the hallway. "You were my only daughter," Sophie quietly said. "She looked just like Mom." Helen flinched. Her eyes moved to the child with sudden alarm. "You saw her too?" Luke asked what she meant, but Helen ignored him. She knelt in front of Sophie and asked whether the woman had spoken again. Sophie nodded. Helen took both of Sophie's hands and told her never to answer. Voices from inside a picture, a mirror, or a camera. She made Sophie promise, then rose and began gathering every photograph in the room. She removed frames from the hallway, stacked them face down, and ordered Luke to start the car. Megan blocked the front door. "Not until you tell me what happened here in 1998. Helen's face hardened. "Nothing happened." "Then why did you drive through worsening snow because I said one name?" The wind pressed against the house. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked. Helen looked toward the ceiling and lowered her voice. "Some names are doors. Once they are opened, the house remembers where to lead you." She refused to say more. They could not leave immediately because snow had already covered the narrow road, and Luke did not trust the steep turn near the bridge after dark. Helen argued until her voice broke, then agreed to stay only until morning. She locked the instant camera inside the cabinet and placed a chair beneath the handle. That evening, Sophie drew at the dining table while the adults searched for blankets and batteries. Megan expected pictures of a lake or the faceless woman. Instead, Sophie filled page after page with the same long hallway. The walls were crowded with framed photographs. A narrow door waited at the far end. In every drawing, a little girl stood before it with her back turned. In the final picture, the girl had turned around. Her face was Megan's face at 10 years old. "Who is she?" Megan asked. Sophie kept drawing. "She says she forgot which one of you came home." Helen dropped the flashlight she was holding. The sound made everyone turn. She picked it up without speaking and left the room. Later, after Sophie fell asleep beside Luke in the upstairs bedroom, Megan found Helen sitting in Thomas's old study with the lights off. Snow reflected through the windows, outlining her against the desk. Megan asked again about Nora. Helen said nothing. Megan placed one of Sophie's drawings in front of her. Helen shut her eyes. "I had 2 girls," she whispered at last. Before Megan could respond, Helen shook her head and covered her mouth, as though the words had escaped against her will. "No, that is not right. I had 1 daughter. I have always had 1 daughter." Her certainty changed even as she spoke. Megan realized the house was not merely hiding the past. It was correcting anyone who tried to remember it. Near midnight, Helen fell asleep in a chair beside Sophie's bed. Megan remained awake in the hall. Shortly after 1, Helen began murmuring. At first the words were indistinct. Then her voice became clear. "Nora, do not let her take Megan again." Megan stepped closer. "Mom, who took me?" Helen's eyes stayed closed. The woman with no face. She woke with a gasp and denied saying anything. Downstairs, Sophie had left her small video camera on the dining table. A red light blinked beside the lens. Megan picked it up and found a recording already in progress. The screen showed the empty hallway leading toward the living room. A woman's voice whispered beneath the soft hiss of the microphone. "Eleanor." Megan stopped the video. Taped beneath the camera was a narrow strip of paper in Thomas's handwriting. It read, "Never say Eleanor's name in front of a lens." Behind Megan, Sophie's sleepy voice repeated the name. The video camera turned on by itself. On its screen, the faceless woman stood at the end of the hall. For the first time, she was not looking toward Sophie. Slowly, impossibly, she turned her blank face toward the camera. The faceless woman raised one hand toward the camera, and every light in the house went out at once. Sophie screamed, not loudly, but with the thin, frightened sound of a child who had seen something move before anyone else believed it was there. Megan pulled her close and backed into the dining room, while the video camera continued recording in the dark. Its small screen remained bright. On it, the hallway was no longer empty. The woman stood halfway between the living room and the stairs, her black dress motionless despite the cold air moving through the house. Behind her, the walls were covered with photographs that did not exist outside the screen. Some showed rooms Megan recognized. Others showed places she had never seen. In every picture, one person had been erased. Luke came downstairs with a flashlight, followed by Helen, who froze when she heard the name Eleanor spoken again from the camera speaker. "Turn it off," Helen said. Megan pressed the power button. Nothing happened. The woman on the screen took one slow step closer. Helen crossed the room, pulled the battery free, and threw it onto the table. The screen stayed on. Then a new image appeared. Luke sat alone at the kitchen table with two untouched plates in front of him. He looked older, exhausted, and confused. A second image replaced it. Sophie's bedroom was empty. The walls had been repainted gray, and the shelves held boxes instead of books and toys. A third image followed. Megan stood at the edge of the lake beneath a colorless sky, holding the faceless woman's hand. Several feet behind them, Sophie faced the camera. Her face was gone. The screen went black. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Luke said the camera had malfunctioned, but his voice sounded less certain than before. Helen sat down hard at the table and stared at the dark screen. Megan asked whether the images showed the future. Helen said no. Then she said she did not know. Sophie whispered that the woman had shown them what would happen if they forgot her. Megan looked at Helen. "Forget who?" Helen kept her eyes lowered. Snow scraped against the windows, and the old house answered with soft cracks inside the walls. Megan carried Sophie upstairs and stayed beside her until she fell asleep. Luke remained in the hallway, watching the bedroom door as if guarding it from something he could not see. When Megan returned downstairs, 3 photographs lay on the dining table. They had not been there before. The first showed Luke eating alone. The second showed Sophie's room without Sophie. The third showed Megan beside the lake with Eleanor. They were identical to the images from the camera. Each photograph was dry, though damp snow clung to the windowsills. Helen refused to touch them. Megan placed the picture of Sophie's empty room in front of her. "You know what this means?" Helen looked toward the stairs. "It means we should leave. The road is buried, and the car cannot make it past the bridge. Then we walk at sunrise." Megan held up the photograph of the lake. Leaving did not save Nora. Helen closed her eyes. Her breathing changed. For several seconds, she seemed to be fighting against words that would not remain buried. "Nora was your sister," she said at last. Luke stopped moving. Megan sat across from her mother. Helen gripped the edge of the table with both hands. "She was your twin. You were born 7 minutes apart. Nora was older. She was quieter than you, but she remembered everything. Every song, every promise, every room she had ever entered." Megan waited for a memory to return. None did. Helen continued. In the summer of 1998, she had brought both girls to the lake house for 2 weeks. Thomas had insisted on taking family portraits every day. He said photographs protected memories. Near the end of the visit, Nora began waking at 3:17 every morning. She claimed a woman stood in the hallway and called Megan by another name. Helen told herself the girls were frightening each other. Then, one night, both children disappeared from their room. Helen found only one of them at the lake. "You were standing on the dock," she whispered. "You were soaked from the knees down, though the water was still." Nora was gone. Megan asked what she had said that night. Helen's face tightened with pain. "You said she had gone into the picture." Luke asked why no one called the police. Helen said they had. Search teams crossed the woods, searched the shallows, and dragged the deeper water. Neighbors brought food. Missing posters covered the town. But within days, something began to change. Nora's name vanished from school records. Her clothes disappeared from drawers. Friends forgot her. Even the officers who had led the search denied that a second child had been reported missing. Helen kept photographs to prove Nora existed, but every picture slowly changed until Megan stood alone. And then I started forgetting too, Helen said. At first I forgot her favorite cereal, then the sound of her voice, then which bed had been hers. Your grandfather told me forgetting was mercy. He said the house corrected what the family could not survive. Megan felt anger rise beneath her fear. You let him erase her. Helen looked up sharply. I fought it. I wrote her name on walls. I recorded myself saying it. I hid letters in places Thomas could not find. Every morning the words were gone, and every day I became more certain I had invented her. Luke picked up the photograph of the empty bedroom. This is happening to Sophie now. Helen nodded. It has already started. Megan turned toward the stairs. The family photographs stacked near the wall had changed again. In the newest picture, Eleanor stood directly behind Sophie, one pale hand touching her shoulder. Luke looked at the same image and asked why Megan had photographed an empty chair. She stared at him. Sophie is sitting there. Luke frowned. Megan, there is nobody in that picture. A soft thump came from upstairs. Megan ran to Sophie's room and found the bed empty. The blankets were neatly folded, and the walls had already begun to fade from pale blue to gray. On the pillow rested a fresh photograph. It showed Sophie standing alone in a long hallway crowded with frames. At the far end, a narrow door had opened, and someone shaped like a little girl was reaching through. Megan seized the photograph from the pillow and heard Sophie whisper her name from somewhere inside the wall. The voice was faint, as though traveling through several closed rooms, but it was unmistakably hers. Megan pressed her ear against the faded gray wallpaper while Luke searched the closet and Helen stood frozen in the doorway. She is not here, Luke said. Megan turned on him. You heard her. Luke looked confused. Heard who? The question chilled Megan more than the empty bed. She held the photograph inches from his face and pointed to Sophie in the hallway. But Luke saw only an empty passage lined with frames. Helen pulled him aside and told Megan not to waste time arguing. The house is taking her in pieces, she said. First the photographs, then the room, then the people who love her. Sophie called again, and this time the sound came from beneath the floor. Megan followed it into Thomas's study, where the voice stopped beside a tall bookcase built into the wall. The shelves were packed with photography manuals, family ledgers, and boxes of glass negatives. Helen helped Megan pull the books away while Luke watched with growing unease, as though he had entered a stranger's emergency. Behind the lowest shelf, Megan found a small iron latch. When she lifted it, the entire bookcase shifted forward with a long wooden groan. A narrow stairway descended into darkness. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of dust, chemicals, and lake water. Helen whispered that Thomas had never allowed anyone into the basement darkroom. Megan took a flashlight and went down. The steps ended in a low chamber beneath the house. A red safety lamp glowed weakly near the ceiling despite the power outage. Trays, bottles, and old enlargers covered the counters. Hundreds of photographs hung from wires, their corners trembling in air that felt completely still. Most showed members of the Crawford family. Some showed empty rooms. Others showed children standing at the edge of the lake while a dark pair of hands appeared impossibly at the bottom of the image, as though reflected in glass that had not been present when the picture was taken. Megan moved closer. The hands did not belong to Eleanor. They were broad, almost shapeless, and always seemed to be operating the lens from the photographer's side. Helen descended behind her and stopped when she saw them. Thomas took these, she said. Megan examined the dates. The same pattern repeated across decades. A child appeared in several portraits. Eleanor emerged somewhere in the background. Then the dark hands became visible at the bottom of the frame. In the final photograph, the child disappeared. She was not taking them, Megan said. Helen did not answer. Megan found a cracked glass negative resting beneath a folded cloth. It showed a formal portrait taken in 1911. Thomas's grandparents sat in front of the old house, surrounded by servants and children. Someone had scratched away the face of a woman standing near the porch. Beside her stood a little girl whose image had been cut from the glass. On the paper sleeve, Thomas had written two names, Eleanor Voss and Grace Voss. Megan held the negative beneath the red lamp. The scratched woman wore the same black dress as the faceless figure in every photograph. Helen crossed herself without seeming to notice. Megan searched the cabinets until she found a second fragment wrapped in wax paper. It fit the missing section of the negative perfectly. When she placed it against the glass, the little girl reappeared beside Eleanor. Grace looked about 10 years old. She had dark hair, serious eyes, and a face that made Megan forget how to breathe. The child looked familiar in a way that had nothing to do with resemblance. Megan recognized the slight tilt of her chin. She knew the shape of her hands. She knew the expression she wore when she was trying not to cry. A memory stirred behind the blank wall of her childhood. A red hallway. A woman calling Grace. A camera flash. Megan nearly dropped the glass. Who was she? Helen asked. Megan turned the sleeve over and found a note written in older ink. Grace vanished during a family portrait on November 17th, 1911. Eleanor accused the Crawfords of hiding the child inside the photographs. She was dismissed, declared unstable, and removed from the property. Every public record of mother and daughter ended that winter. Helen read the note twice. Thomas told me Eleanor was the curse. Thomas Leet. Megan looked around the darkroom. The walls were covered with his handwriting. At first the notes appeared to be warnings. Never allow Eleanor near a child. Never speak her name before a lens. Never restore the missing face. But another page, hidden beneath a stack of film envelopes, revealed their true purpose. The instructions described how to preserve the correction. Photograph the chosen child at 3:17. Remove the child's name from the family record. Allow memory to follow the image. Prevent Eleanor from interfering. Megan felt sick as the meaning settled over her. Thomas had not been protecting the family from the faceless woman. He had been maintaining the thing that erased them. A soft knock came from inside the far wall. Megan followed it to a row of hanging photographs. Behind them was a small viewing window made of cloudy red glass. Sophie stood on the other side. She was several feet away in a hallway that could not physically exist beyond the wall. Framed, portraits stretched behind her into darkness. Megan placed both hands against the glass. Sophie saw her and ran forward, but the distance between them did not change. Eleanor appeared behind Sophie. Megan shouted for her daughter to run, but Eleanor did not reach for the child. Instead, she stepped between Sophie and something approaching from the far end of the corridor. A camera flash burst through the hallway. Eleanor raised her arms, shielding Sophie from the light. For 1 second, her blank face became clear. Megan saw a grieving woman with tired eyes and a scar beneath her left eyebrow. Then the features vanished again. A shadow moved behind an old camera at the end of the hall. 2 dark hands adjusted the lens. Sophie pointed toward them and screamed something Megan could not hear. Eleanor turned to Megan and pressed one palm against the opposite side of the red glass. Images flooded the window. Thomas standing in the darkroom. Thomas writing Nora's name, then crossing it out. Thomas photographing children at 3:17 while Eleanor struggled to reach them. In every image, the faceless woman was not hunting anyone. She was warning them. The final vision showed Thomas behind the camera, but his face was hidden by a darkness that seemed to pour from the lens itself. Eleanor mouthed 4 words through the glass. He is still taking them. Then the red window cracked, the hallway vanished, and Sophie disappeared with it. The moment the red window went dark, Luke forgot that Sophie had ever existed. Megan knew it before he spoke, because the fear vanished from his face and was replaced by confusion. He looked around the darkroom at the hanging photographs, the cracked glass, and Megan's hands pressed against the wall. "Why are we down here?" he asked. Megan stared at him. "Sophie is trapped inside those pictures." Luke's expression tightened with concern. "Who is Sophie?" The question left a silence deeper than the basement. Helen gripped the counter as if the floor had shifted beneath her, but when Megan turned toward her, Uncertainty had already begun clouding her eyes. "Your daughter," Megan said. "My daughter. Your granddaughter." Luke shook his head slowly. "Megan, we do not have children." She pushed past him and ran upstairs. The bedroom at the end of the hall no longer belonged to Sophie. The pale blue walls had turned gray. The shelves that had held books, stuffed animals, and framed school photographs were filled with sealed cardboard boxes. The bed was gone. In its place stood an old folding table covered in fishing gear and winter blankets. Megan opened the closet and found coats that had belonged to Thomas. Not one dress, backpack, or pair of sneakers remained. She searched her phone. Hundreds of photographs had changed. Every family vacation showed only Megan and Luke. Birthday videos ended before anyone blew out the candles. Messages from the school had vanished. The emergency contact forms, medical records, and digital calendar entries that had shaped 10 years of their lives were gone. Megan called Sophie's school in Bellwether. The office secretary searched twice and said no student by that name had ever been enrolled. Luke stood in the doorway, watching Megan with the cautious patience of someone trying to calm a stranger. "There has never been a Sophie," he said. Megan opened the instant photograph taken by the fireplace. Sophie still stood there, but only Megan could see her. Eleanor's pale hand hovered beside the child's shoulder, and for the first time Megan understood the gesture. It was not a claim. It was an anchor. Eleanor's touch did not cause the erasure. It bound a trace of the threatened person to an image or preserved that person in the mind of whoever she touched. In the first family picture, she had touched Megan, fastening Sophie's existence to her mind before the correction began. That was why Megan still remembered. That was why the others did not. Helen entered the room carrying the leather album, although she no longer remembered why she had brought it. Megan showed her the doc photograph and said Nora's name. Helen repeated it softly. For one heartbeat, grief returned to her face. Then it slipped away again. "I think I knew someone by that name," she whispered. Megan took her mother's hands. "You had 2 daughters. Nora was taken here. Sophie has been taken now." Helen looked toward the gray walls, and tears rose before memory could explain them. "Then do not let me forget again." Megan wrote both names across Helen's palms with a black marker. Sophie, Nora. The ink remained, even when Helen could no longer remember who they were. Downstairs, the clock above the mantel began ticking for the first time in years. Its hands moved backward, passing 11, 10, and 9 before stopping at 3:17. The instant camera clicked inside the locked cabinet. A fresh photograph slid through the gap beneath the door. It showed the basement darkroom, but one wall was different. A large formal portrait hung where the red viewing window had been. In front of it stood Eleanor, her blank face turned toward a low bank of wooden drawers. Megan carried the photograph downstairs. The cracked viewing window had gone opaque, reflecting only the red lamp. Following Eleanor's position in the picture, Megan pulled the drawers from the wall and uncovered a wide, flat recess. Inside lay a full-size paper portrait of the Crawford family in 1911, mounted on heavy board. The family sat before the lake house in formal clothes. Eleanor stood at the edge of the group, her face scratched away. Beside her was a child-shaped opening where Grace had been cut from the print. Tucked behind the portrait was the missing paper fragment. It was not the shard of glass negative Megan had restored earlier, but the matching piece of the original photograph. Grace's small face looked out from it with the same serious eyes Megan had recognized beneath the red lamp. Megan fit the paper fragment into the opening. The room seemed to exhale. Cold air moved across the floor, and the surface of the portrait rippled like dark water. Somewhere beyond it, Sophie began calling. Luke stepped backward, but Megan held the fragment in place. The painted doorway behind the Crawford family slowly opened, revealing the endless hallway Sophie had drawn. Framed photographs covered the walls, each one holding a person the family had forgotten. Children watched silently from behind glass. Adults stood in rooms that no longer existed. At the far end, a small figure moved through the shadows. Megan called Sophie's name, but the child who approached was not her daughter. A girl stepped through the painted doorway and into the darkroom. She wore denim shorts, a blue shirt, and white sneakers stained with dried lake mud. Her dark hair was cut to her shoulders. She looked exactly like the second child in the photographs from the summer of 1998. Helen stared at the name written across her palm, then at the girl. Her knees nearly gave way. "Nora," she whispered. The girl turned toward her, but her expression held more sorrow than recognition. Then she looked directly at Megan. Fear and relief crossed her young face at the same time. She stepped closer and reached for Megan's hand. "You came back," she said. Megan could barely speak. "Nora, where's Sophie?" The girl glanced toward the corridor. With Megan. They were trying to keep her away from the camera. Megan felt the darkroom narrow around her. "I am Megan." Nora studied her face, then shook her head. "No, you are wearing Megan's face." Her grip tightened. "You are Grace." Nora's words did not awaken a memory in Grace. They shattered one. The darkroom disappeared behind a burst of white light, and for a moment she was 10 years old again, standing barefoot in the red hallway, while two girls struggled with a locked door on the other side. One wore yellow, the other wore blue. Both were calling for their mother. Thomas stood nearby with the old camera raised his eye. He told Grace not to listen. He told her that photographs could correct mistakes, that a family could survive any loss if the image left no empty space behind. Then the memory folded inward, leaving her back in the basement with Nora gripping her hand. "How do you know me?" Grace asked. Nora glanced toward the open portrait. "Because I saw you in there before Grandfather pushed you out. You were holding Megan's hand. You kept telling us your name." Helen stepped between them, staring from Nora to the names written across her palms. "Tell me what happened," she said. Nora looked at her mother for a long time. "I am Nora," she said. "Megan is still inside." Helen made a broken sound and covered her mouth. Luke watched them without recognition, unable to remember Sophie or either of Helen's daughters, yet unwilling to leave. Grace turned the restored glass negative toward the red lamp. The painted doorway remained open, and beyond it the corridor shifted like a reflection disturbed by water. Eleanor stood inside, one hand extended. Her face was still blank, but when Grace moved closer, images began forming across the glass. Two girls appeared beside the lake in 1998. Megan wore yellow. Nora wore blue. Thomas arranged them before his camera while Helen argued with him from the porch. Another image surfaced behind them, older and dimmer. Grace Voss stood on the same ground in 1911, wearing a white collar and holding Eleanor's hand. Thomas's grandfather raised a camera. A shadow gathered behind the lens. The scenes overlapped until all three children seemed to occupy the same patch of earth across different generations. Eleanor pressed her palm against the painted doorway, and understanding entered Grace's mind without sound. The house had never demanded a death. It demanded an identity. Whenever the Crawford family feared exposure, grief, or disgrace, the presence behind the camera removed one person from the record and used another to fill the empty place. Names moved. Faces moved. Memories followed. In 1911, Grace vanished during the Crawford portrait. Eleanor accused the family of trapping her child inside the photographs. To silence her, the Crawfords erased Eleanor's face and name from every image they controlled. Eleanor died years later, but the part of her memory anchored in the photographs remained, searching for Grace and warning each new target. Grace stayed inside the corridor for 87 years. In 1998, Thomas continued the ritual. Megan had begun seeing Grace in mirrors and hearing Eleanor call from old photographs. Thomas feared that the buried story would return through her, so he chose Megan for another correction. When the lens opened, Megan was pulled into the corridor. Nora followed and tried to bring her back. For a few seconds, both sisters held Grace's hands. Then the thing behind the camera forced an exchange. Megan and Nora were sealed inside, while Grace was pushed into the world, wearing Megan's face and wrapped in fragments of Megan's memory. Helen found one child beside the lake and accepted her as Megan because the photographs, documents, and everyone around her insisted that Megan had come home alone. The correction was imperfect. Grace remembered almost nothing before the age of 10 because those early memories had never belonged to her. Old cameras felt familiar because she had spent decades behind their glass. Eleanor's message had not been an accusation. It had been a desperate attempt to make Grace remember who she was. Grace looked at her adult hands, marked by 26 years of work, marriage, and motherhood. Those years were real, even if the name beneath them had been borrowed. "Then Sophie is trapped because of me," she said. Eleanor shook her head. The movement was small but immediate. Nora tightened her grip. "Sophie is trapped because Thomas needed another empty place. He always made the person who survived believe it was their fault." Grace looked toward the corridor. "Where's Megan?" "She stayed with Sophie when the camera found her," Nora said. "She's been hiding people in the pictures Thomas cannot develop." A new photograph slid down the basement steps and stopped at Grace's feet. It showed Sophie inside the corridor, standing beside the real Megan, who still wore the yellow shirt from 1998. Both faced a tall camera mounted on a tripod. Behind it stood Thomas, not as the man who had died 3 weeks earlier, but as a photographic echo built from every portrait he had ever taken. His outline shifted between ages. Darkness flowed from beneath the camera cloth and joined the lens to his face. One hand rested on the shutter release. The other pointed toward an empty place beside Sophie. Written beneath the image were 4 words: "Return the borrowed face." Helen saw only blank paper. Luke saw an empty hallway. Grace saw Sophie beginning to lose definition around the edges. Eleanor lifted one hand, warning Grace not to enter without a plan. The meaning was clear. The echo of Thomas wanted an exchange. If Grace surrendered Megan's face and identity, the real Megan could leave, but Grace would be erased. If Grace refused, Sophie would become the next correction. Nora pointed to the darkroom walls. "There's another way. The camera can remove only the people the family agrees to forget." Grandfather hid every missing name here because written names kept the corridor from closing completely. Under the red lamp, faint lettering emerged beneath layers of paint, across the backs of photographs, and inside the margins of Thomas's ledgers. Samuel, Lydia, Grace, Nora, Megan, dozens more. Some belonged to children. Others belonged to servants, relatives, and witnesses who had challenged the Crawford version of the past. Eleanor's touch had preserved a trace of each one, but a trace was not enough to bring them home. Their names had to be spoken, recorded, and accepted together. The clock upstairs began striking 3:17, one slow chime after another. The portrait darkened. Sophie's voice came through the doorway. "Mom, he says you have to choose." Grace looked at Eleanor, at Nora standing in the blue shirt she had worn 26 years earlier, and at Helen struggling to remember both daughters at once. Then Grace lifted Thomas's camera, turned it toward the wall of hidden names, and gave the presence behind the lens the only answer it had never expected. "No one else is being forgotten." Grace raised Thomas's camera toward the wall, and the hidden names brightened beneath the red lamp as if the house had been waiting more than a century to hear them spoken aloud. "Samuel Crawford," she said. A photograph near the ceiling trembled, and a boy appeared where an empty porch chair had been. "Lydia Crawford." Another frame cleared, revealing a girl beside the lake. Grace continued, reading every name she could find beneath the paint, across the backs of envelopes, and inside the margins of Thomas's ledgers. Helen repeated each one after her. Nora joined in, her child's voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Even Luke, who could not remember the missing people, began speaking their names because he understood that memory was not the same as truth. The painted doorway widened. Cold air rushed through the darkroom, carrying whispers from the corridor beyond. Faces emerged inside the frames lining its walls. Children opened their eyes. Adults turned toward the sound of their own names. At the far end, Sophie stood beside Megan in the yellow shirt while the shifting echo of Thomas held one hand above the shutter. "Stop," his voice said from beneath the black cloth. It sounded like several old recordings playing at once. "The family cannot hold them all." Grace looked through the viewfinder of the camera in her hands. The corridor became clear. Thomas was not standing alone. Behind him spread a darkness shaped by every secret the Crawfords had preserved through silence. It had no human face, only a lens surrounded by shadows. Thomas had become its latest keeper, and after death his memory had remained attached to the machine. "They were never yours to erase," Grace said. She turned the camera away from Sophie and aimed it at the wall of names. Thomas pressed the shutter in the corridor. A flash filled both spaces. The borrowed memories inside Grace pulled in opposite directions. She saw herself as Grace Voss in 1911, holding Eleanor's hand. She saw fragments of Megan's childhood in 1998, running beside Nora through the cedar trees. She saw Sophie's first day of school, Luke asleep beside an unfinished crib, Helen teaching her to braid hair, and Thomas watching from behind camera. The memories were not equal, but all of them had shaped the person she had become. Returning a face did not require surrendering a life. The curse had survived by insisting that only one person could occupy a place in the family story. Grace refused that rule. "My name is Grace Voss," she said. "I lived as Megan Whitmore, and I am Sophie's mother and Luke's wife. Those truths do not require Megan or Nora to disappear." Eleanor stepped beside her. For the first time, her face remained visible. Tired eyes, the narrow scar beneath her left eyebrow, and a mother's grief softened by recognition. Grace placed one hand over Eleanor's on the camera. Together, they pressed the shutter. The flash struck the wall of names instead of child. Every hidden photograph developed at once. Samuel appeared beside his parents. Lydia returned to the lake. Servants, cousins, daughters, sons, and witnesses filled the spaces from which they had been removed. The corridor shook as its frames changed. Empty rooms became crowded. Missing chairs were occupied. The silence that had protected the Crawford family broke into hundreds of voices speaking their own names. Thomas staggered behind the tripod. His outline shifted from old man to younger man to shadow. "Someone must remain," he warned. "The door requires a keeper." Eleanor looked toward Grace, but Grace shook her head. "That was another rule your family taught people to fear." She called Sophie's name. Nora called Megan's name. Helen spoke both daughters' names with such force that the sound seemed to travel through every frame. Luke closed his eyes, searching for the child the house had taken from him. Then he whispered, "Sophie." A memory returned to his face. He said the name again, louder. "Sophie Whitmore." Upstairs, the gray storage room became blue once more. Books returned to the shelves. School photographs reappeared on the walls. Messages filled Grace's phone. In the corridor, Sophie's face sharpened. Megan reached for her hand, and together they ran toward the painted doorway. Thomas reached for the camera, but Eleanor stepped in front of the lens. He pressed the shutter. This time, the flash did not erase her. Her restored face held steady, because her name was being spoken by people who accepted what had happened to her. Thomas recoiled as his own features vanished from the photographs around him. No one had placed a curse on him. The family had simply stopped carrying his false version of the story. His voice faded into the clicking of an empty camera. The darkness behind the lens folded inward, and the corridor collapsed into a single photograph resting on the darkroom floor. Sophie stumbled through the doorway and into Luke's arms. He held her, as if he could recover 10 years of memory in one embrace. Megan followed, still wearing the yellow shirt and the face of a 10-year-old. Helen knelt between her daughters. "I remember you," she said. "Megan and Nora. I remember both of you." Nora took Megan's hand. Light moved across both sisters at once, not changing who they were, but releasing the years the corridor had held in place. Their childlike faces matured. Their hair lengthened and darkened, with faint silver beginning at Nora's temples. Within moments, two women of 36 stood before Helen, alike enough to be twins and different enough to be unmistakable. The house stopped correcting them. By morning, the snow had ended. Family records no longer erased the missing, although the restored truth arrived unevenly, like photographs developing in separate trays. Birth certificates, school files, letters, and portraits now acknowledged Megan and Nora Crawford. Old records also carried the names of Samuel, Lydia, Grace, Eleanor, and the others. Grace began the legal process of reclaiming her original identity while preserving the family ties she had built. In time, she became Grace Voss Whitmore, Luke never pretended the truth was simple, but he recognized the woman he loved in every memory they had made together. Sophie called her mom without hesitation. Megan and Nora had to learn a world that had continued without them, and Helen had to grieve the years she had been forced to forget. None of them recovered overnight, but for the first time their pain belonged to real people with real names. 1 year later, Grace opened a small photography exhibit in Portland called The Remembered. The final room contained the restored Crawford portrait from 1911, displayed beside a new family photograph taken at the lake. Grace stood with Luke and Sophie. Helen stood between the adult Megan and Nora. In the developed image, Eleanor appeared beside Grace with a clear, peaceful face, one hand resting lightly near her daughter's shoulder. This time, the gesture meant only that she had found her. Every missing name was printed beneath the photographs. Visitors often said the final image felt unusually alive, although none could explain why. On the last night of the exhibit, Grace remained alone after closing. In the glass covering the 1911 portrait, she noticed Thomas standing several feet behind her with the old camera in his hands. His face was blank, and the lens pointed directly at her. Grace did not turn around. She looked into the reflection and spoke clearly. "Thomas Crawford, I remember what you did." The figure lowered the camera. Then it disappeared, leaving only Grace's face in the glass, entirely her own at last.